Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, Coping with Guilt During Bereavement. I'm Pat Loader, the Executive Director of the Compassionate Friends. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Bob Baugher, who is a psychologist and a certified death educator and teaches at Highline Community College in Des Moines, Washington. He is a 25-year member of the advisory board of the South King County chapter of the Compassionate Friends. From 1995 to 1996, Bob served as a clinician with the University of Washington for the Parent Bereavement Project. Bob is the author of grief-related books, one of which is titled Understanding Guilt During Bereavement. He has been invited as a workshop presenter at TCF national conferences for the past 15 years. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you. How are we doing out there, everybody? Are you ready to listen to some information about guilt? One of the things that I want to tell you is that I didn't sit down myself and just think about this information and come by it myself. I've talked to literally thousands of parents over the years and siblings and grandparents who themselves have experienced their own issues of guilt after the death of a child. So a lot of this information is going to come from people who've really been there, and as we go through this, I hope you're going to get some information that's going to help you out. So let me give you a summary of what we're going to talk about. One of the things that is important to keep in mind is that guilt is a feeling. So you probably have had the experience of someone saying, well, don't feel guilty. Did you then turn to that person and say, well, thanks a lot, I guess I don't feel guilty anymore? Well, of course not, because what happens is it's a feeling, and of course you can't talk someone out of a feeling. Another thing we're going to look at are guilt statements, sort of how to identify when guilt's coming up for us. A third area that we're going to talk about is types of guilt, and we're going to have a little questionnaire for you later on about that. And then next we're going to take a look at what are called dimensions of guilt. You know, how do we think about guilt? How physically does it come up, and those kinds of things. And then we'll finish up talking about suggestions for coping with guilt, again coming from people who've really been through it. So here's what I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to say don't feel guilty, because that's not what this is about. You feel guilty because we are human, and that's part of what happens when a significant event takes place in our life and we look back and try to make sense out of something that's really senseless. So let's take a look at guilt statements and take a look at the kinds of things that people say and see if any of these apply to you. Sometimes when I give the workshop for the Compassionate Friends National Conference, they like to call it dealing with the if-onlys and I should-haves. So if sometimes that comes up for you, and if only, well, then guess what? That's probably related to guilt. Or another one is, why didn't I? Or why did I? Another one is, I should have. Or sometimes people say, I should have. Or I shouldn't have. Or I don't deserve to. Sometimes we find ourselves beating ourselves up because of the guilt that we have. Another one is, I don't deserve to. You know, I've failed to do this thing, or I did this terrible thing, and I don't deserve to be happy, or whatever. Or this was payment for. You know, I was this terrible person, and this is why this happened. Or I'm not worthy of paid back. Or I'm not worthy of. Or I didn't take the time to. So let's take a look next at, now that we've gotten an idea of some guilt statements and the kinds of things that people say to themselves, let's go through a number of types of guilt. And where do I get these from? Well, there was a study done many years ago by Demai and Moore, who did some interesting research on asking parents what types of guilt that they felt. So I looked at those and I added to them as over the years parents told me and grandparents and siblings told me, here's some different types of guilt that they experienced as well. One is called death causation guilt. And what this says is that I did something that caused this death to occur. And what's important here is it doesn't matter whether you had anything specifically to do with it. It's that you perceive that you could have done something, should have done something, or failed to do something. I always tell this story when I give the guilt workshop at the TCF conference. I had a mom, about 15 years ago, who raised her hand when I got to this death causation guilt. And here's what she said to the group and to me. There were about 60 parents sitting there. She said, you know, the last time I saw my son, he was 17 years old. He was just ready to walk out the door, and later on he was hit by a truck on the freeway in his car, and he was killed. But of course I remember the last moments, and he turned to me and he said, "Bye, Mom." And I said, "Bye." And he walked out the door, and that's the last time I saw him alive. Well, I kept thinking to myself later, why didn't I say, "Be careful"? Maybe if I said "be careful," he would have seen that truck coming in. Or then maybe if I had said, "I love you," then he would have stopped for a moment. He would have said, "I love you too, Mom," and that might have delayed him for a couple seconds, and maybe that truck wouldn't have hit him. And do you know, sitting at that workshop, looking around at those parents, there was not one parent there, or grandparent, or sibling, who could turn to that mom and talk her out of the grief that she was feeling, because that's what she felt, that's what she perceived. And so for her, she had to work on that guilt. But the first step was identifying it and saying, yep, that seems to be what I'm experiencing. Second one is called illness-related guilt, or moment of death guilt. And that is during the time someone was ill, we felt that we didn't help them enough, didn't visit them enough, didn't do enough. For example, if your child or grandchild or sibling was in the hospital, maybe you felt you should have advocated more, or found ways to reduce their pain, or tried more things with the doctor, or anything just so things would have been maybe a little easier. Maybe it wouldn't have stopped the death from occurring, but you just look back and say, why didn't I do more? Or the moment of death guilt, where, you know, here comes the I should have been there. I should have done something. And so finding a way to replay that over and over in our head is what happens with guilt. Another one is called failure or role guilt. And this comes up with a mom saying, looking back on the life of her and her child and saying, I should have been a better mother. Or a dad saying, I should have done more things with him. Or grandparents saying, I should have done more. Or a sibling feeling like I wasn't a good enough brother or sister. So if any of those relate to you, guess what? That's called failure or role guilt. And you know what? We're still waiting for that perfect family. I'd like to tell this story. Some of you have seen this cartoon before. So I want you to imagine this big conference hall. And at the other side of the conference hall is this big banner. And it says, "Welcome, Conference for Functional Families." And there's one guy sitting there in the audience, right? That's right, because what are we doing? We're waiting for that perfect family. We're waiting for that father who can look back and say, yep, I did everything right. We're waiting for that mother to say, I was the perfect mother, I did it all. And waiting for that brother or sister who said, oh, I treated my brother or sister just perfect. Or, or in the case of grandchildren, I was there for my grandchildren all the time, and so on. So guess what? We as humans end up beating ourselves up because of that. Let's take a look at 3 more. And in fact, we got even more coming after that. So you see 3 of them sitting here, one called moral guilt. This is one that says maybe somehow God did this, or maybe I failed to do the kinds of things that I should have been doing, so somehow this was some sort of spiritual payback or cosmic payback, or something that says, why didn't I, why wasn't something there to stop this from happening? Or it may be that someone felt that they did something morally wrong. Maybe a brother or sister, stole something or lied or did something that they felt was so terrible, and now their brother or sister dies, and now they're feeling like that's the reason for it. And you know, our brain is always trying to make sense out of things, and so sometimes that's what we do. We go back in the past and turn it over and over and over. And then another one you see is if only guilt. Okay? You can recognize this because you start this sentence with those words. You know, if only I had been there. If only I had known. If only I hadn't done that. And so we if only ourselves to death, you know. And a big one is, if only it had been me. And I know many of you sitting out there today who are listening to this have probably said to yourselves many times, it should have been me. I should have been the one. I would give anything to change places with my loved one. But you know what? That's not what happened. You're here. You're here living a life probably that you never imagined. And each day you have to get up and deal with the fact that, you know, here you are living another day. And related to that then is unmentionable guilt. That there are people who have feelings that they just find too difficult to share with someone else. And so I want you to think about this one for a moment. If you have some type of guilt, that you feel that there's some guilt that you're carrying that you really find it difficult to tell someone else about, then I want you to think about who might that be? Who might be that one person who can be a good listener, who can really sit down with you and listen to the kind of guilt that you're experiencing? Or maybe it's your support group where you can go to them and say, you know, I listened to this webinar on guilt and I want to say something to everyone here. And then you share maybe this secret or this deep down feeling that you've been having about the guilt that you want to share. And the important thing is that you get it out, but you get it out with someone that you trust. Just don't go out and suddenly blurt it all out and wonder what's going to happen next, but instead to be able to sit down and say, this is the person that I choose, and I choose you, and this is what I want to tell you. And maybe even you want to set it up ahead of time so they aren't going to, you know, try to fix it or try to talk you out of it. The important thing is that right now you find a way to say it. And you may not be ready for this. The important thing is to say to yourself, you know, when am I going to be ready? Another type of guilt is called pain to others guilt. It's hard enough experiencing the death, and then the death of a child or a brother or sister or grandchild. And it's tough enough dealing with your own feelings of grief, but then you look around and you see other people hurting, and you realize that you can't fix it. For some dads, they come up to me, especially after the workshop on anger that I give, and they say, you know, I always thought as a dad, as a husband, I could fix things. That was my job. Something's wrong, you know, you go to Dad, and he's supposed to fix it. And they say to me, and I realize I can't fix it. For the first time in my life, this is something that I have absolutely no control over, and I watch other people hurt, and I feel guilty that I can't do something about it. And that is hard. It's a very hard lesson to deal with, and yet it's part of this craziness that we call grief and guilt. Another type of guilt, and this is a tough one for some people, is relief guilt. Maybe that person who died had some problems in their life, had caused you problems, and woken you up at 3 in the morning. And for those of you who can't identify with this, that's fine. Some people have relief guilt, and that is that they know they're not going to get that phone call at 3 in the morning again. They know they're not going to feel, you know, upset or threatened or whatever with this person, and therefore they're of all of the feelings that they're having and all the types of guilt they're having, one other one they're having is a sense of relief, which guess what? They feel guilty about that they're relieved. And so here we are again, our brain sort of almost playing these tricks on us. Another type of guilt is benefit guilt, that after the person dies, some sort of benefit comes to you. When I was doing the Parent Bereavement Project back in the 1990s, where I sat for 10 weeks at a time with 5 or 6 parents over a period of years, helping them understand some of the craziness of guilt. Some parents said that they found that after their adult child had died, that an insurance settlement came in a check came in the mail. and they're opening this envelope, looking at this paperwork and looking at this check going, what is this? What am I supposed to do with this money now? I want my child back. I don't want this money. And so for them, they feel guilty just having this benefit. And then what do we do with this money? Do we put it in the bank? Do we put forth a memorial? Do we give it away? You know, what do we do with it? And so for many people, that's a tough issue to deal with. And of course, you know about survivor guilt. You know, I tell my students, I teach a class called Death and Life at Highline Community College near Seattle. And I talk to them about the fact that many of them are young and many of them are under age 30. And I talk to them about the passionate friends. I talk to them about parental grief, the grief of a sister or a brother, grief being a grandmother or grandfather. And I say, your job is to outlive your parents and your grandparents. That's your job, which means at some point, you know, your mom's going to die before you and your dad's going to die before you. But you know what? That's what they want. No parent wants to outlive their child. I remember one of the first talks I gave for the Seattle TCF group, a man came up to me afterwards, and he was in his 70s. He said, my son was 50 when he died. He said, that was wrong. My son should not have died before me. And so survivor guilt. You know, here you are surviving even though you don't want to feel like it. Another type of guilt is called grief guilt. Years ago, one of the first articles that I wrote for Grief magazine was called, What If I Grieved Perfectly? We're still waiting for that perfect griever, that perfect person who can come up. You know, I haven't had anyone ever come up to me and say, you know, Bob, I'm grieving just right. I'm crying just the right amount of tears. I'm angry just the right amount. I'm sad just about. You know, it's not what happened. Okay, what we do is we play it over and over. Why am I grieving this way? Why am I experiencing it? And you know, one of the things that I've learned about grief, and especially about guilt, is that you grieve however you're going to grieve, and not let anyone else tell you, you know, you're grieving wrong, you should do this, you know, how come you do it, not doing more of that. You just let yourself grieve. Give yourself permission however you're going to grieve. Maybe you're not crying enough. Well, guess what? You're crying however you're going to cry, rather than saying, oh, gee, I should be crying more. I should have been angry more, especially if someone else took your child's life or some other situation was responsible for it. You know, it's so easy to say, why am I not angry more? Well, you're angry however you're going to be angry. Another type of guilt, and a huge one, is moving on guilt. And one of the things I say to my students is that we get up after a loved one dies, we get up the next day, and we feel horrible. And we go through the day however we get through the day. And we go to sleep that night, and we wake up, and it's another day. And then it's another day. And pretty soon, it's a week. It's a week since our loved one dies. How could I have even lived a week? And then a few more days, another week or two goes by, and pretty soon it's a month. And for many of us, we care about what date that is of the month. So if our loved one died on the 17th, then the next 17th that comes up is significant for us, because we think about where we were and what we were doing and what that 17th meant for us. And then pretty soon it's 2 months, and then 3, and pretty soon it's a half a year. How could I have been moving on for a half a year? I don't believe how this could happen. And then as the months go by, and pretty soon you start approaching the month where your child or your brother or sister died, and all of it starts coming back again even more intensely. And as we know, many people feel like that whole month or the month before that is just something that they can hardly handle. What's going on? Well, one of the things happening is you have all these triggers out there. All of these, the smell in the air, the leaves on the trees, or no leaves, or the temperature. All these things are bringing back to us again where we were, a year ago. And so we realize again that we're moving on, and it's scary to people because they feel like, if I move on, then guess what? I'm leaving my loved one behind. And I want you to know, and other people who've been through this want you to know, that you're not leaving your loved one behind. And we're going to talk about some ways of coping with that and suggestions for dealing with that. I'll give you an example of it. A man at a TCF group years ago told me the story. He said his daughter had died. She was 10 years old. She died from an accidental overdose of medication. And he said, I would walk down the hallway to my bedroom, and on the left wall was my favorite picture of her. And just before I turned to go in my bedroom, I would turn and acknowledge her, and I'd say something, I love you, or I miss you, or I remember the time when you did this, and I would just, say something to her. And then one day, several months after the death of his daughter, he found himself standing in his bedroom. What happened? Yes, he forgot. How did he feel? Terrible, of course. Now, the only positive thing out of this was that a couple days later was his TCF meeting. And he went to his meeting, and he told me later, he said to the group, I have something that I have to tell you. And he said, and he told the story and said, I forgot to look at her. What kind of father am I that would forget to acknowledge his daughter? And he was in the exact right place for people to hear his story, because they all turned to him and they said, it's okay. We know you love your daughter, and we know you're never going to forget her. And we know that she's in your heart, and we know that you're human, and that sometimes you forget things, you get distracted, something happens, but it doesn't mean that you're forgetting her. And he heard the words, and they weren't perfect, and he didn't suddenly go, okay, I'm fine. But it did ease his guilt a little bit. And for those of you who find sometimes things slip by for you, it's important to say, it's okay. You are human. All right, I want to stop at this point and have Pat come on. And I've put together a few questions that I want to pose to you now that we've gone through types of guilt, and have you, if you're able to respond to some of these questions. Pat, are you there?
I am.
All right.
So I'll go ahead and launch the first poll, and this one is, are you one of the following: a bereaved parent, a bereaved grandparent, bereaved sibling, or none of the above? And just click your to vote as to where you are on this poll, and we'll give them a few minutes here.
Okay.
Because we still have people coming on. Okay. Okay. And we'll go ahead and close the poll and share with you the results. We have 86% of our audience, they're bereaved parents, 1% bereaved grandparents, bereaved siblings at 3%, and none of the above at 10%. So, do you want to take all of the questions or all of the polls right now?
Sure.
All right.
Let's go ahead.
All right. So, for each of the following types of guilt listed below, click on those you have experienced since the death of your loved one. Death causation guilt, illness-related or of the moment of death guilt, failure or role guilt, moral guilt, if only guilt. And I think we all have that if only guilt. And we're going to have a few more of the types of guilt after this, but we can only get so many on your so many questions on here. So, all right, and we'll go ahead and close the poll. And sharing the results: 57% death causation guilt, 35% illness-related or moment of death guilt, failure or role guilt, 74%, moral guilt, 40%. If only guilt. See, I knew that was way up there at 93%. Let me hide that one and go to the next questions. This again has to do with guilt, survivor's guilt, unmentionable guilt, pain to others guilt, relief guilt, benefit guilt. Which one do you find, Bob, to be the
Death causation guilt is way up there, and role guilt and if only guilt. Those are
big ones, huh?
Those are ones that are always, at the top of the list, definitely.
Okay, let's see how people are voting on this one. We'll close the poll and share the results. Survivor guilt, 68%. Unmentionable guilt at 47%. Pain to others guilt, 41%. Relief guilt, 29%. And benefit guilt, 25%. And then we have one more on the types of guilt, and that would be grief guilt and moving on guilt. It is difficult when you feel that first pang that you've moved on a little bit. It comes slowly, but it feels, you feel it. And give you a few more seconds and we're going to close the poll. And let's close it and share the results. Grief guilt, 61%, and moving on guilt, 76%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you want to do that last one then, Pat?
Sure, will do. Okay. Consider the guilt you've been carrying on a daily basis. What has been the general level of intensity of the guilt? Extremely high, somewhat high, mid-level intensity, very low intensity, or almost absent? Give you a few more minutes. And let's close the poll and share the results. Extremely high, 25%. Somewhat high, 29%. Mid-level intensity, 29%. Very low intensity, 10%. And almost absent at 6%. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Pat, for doing that. And then I know we'll have some questions that you're going to jump in at some point if you like, and we can field some of those as well. But thank you for responding, everyone. This is really supporting a lot of what people have said to me over the years, that this is there's all kinds of guilt that people experience, and quite often it's very high or somewhat high, and so you're feeling it, and guess what? It's as we mentioned before, no one's job to try to talk you out of it. Okay, so let's take a look next at dimensions of guilt and talk about those for a moment. In other words, when we think about guilt, what are different ways to think about it? How does it affect us? And so one way is called the cognitive approach, which of course is how we think about guilt. That is, what do we say to ourselves? So think for a moment. What are the kinds of words that you say to yourself when you're feeling guilty? The I should-haves and if-onlys and so on. What ones, and especially in some of those guilt statements, came up for you? And another piece of that is something, and here comes a little psychology coming your way, called hindsight bias. You may want to Google that at some point, hindsight bias. I don't have that down there, but it's part of this cognitive dimension thing. And basically what it means is, after, we always hear hindsight is 20/20. And after something happens, it's so easy for us to go back and look at it again and rerun it and say, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I notice that? Why didn't I see that coming? You know, many parents have said to me that the day their child died, that the sky looked different, and that they felt that maybe something was going to happen, but they didn't know what it was. And so, of course, then they look back later and say, why didn't I act on that? You know, and yet they forget all the times that maybe the sky looked something like that, and yet here they are. You know, and why do we have this? Because our brain is, you know, of course, always trying to make sense out of things. So the cognitive dimension. Of course, there's a physical dimension. And they did some interesting work years ago on looking at parts of the brain where they found a part of the brain actually was a part where we have regret. And so they found that for people who had a certain part of the brain damaged, that they didn't have the kind of same kinds of regret that most people do. And for many people, it's like, well, gee, you know, I wish I had that. Okay, and so it's called the orbital frontal cortex of the brain, region of the brain connected to both areas of reasoned planning and emotional responses. And so, in a way, we are the victims of having a part of our brain that is not damaged and has regret. So if you're sitting with someone right now, why don't you turn to someone and ask, do you know that you're here today listening to this and that you're feeling all this guilt because of your orbital frontal cortex, right? And if yours didn't function, you'd still be here at this listening to this, but you'd be sitting someplace else wondering, why are people listening to guilt, right? Because what happens is our brain is automatic and we come up with regret even when it's not there. Of course, another dimension is the spiritual dimension. For some people, they've questioned, why would God do this? Why would God take my loved one away? And so for them, sometimes it's a huge struggle with trying to figure out why, you know, why would this happen to them? And so, you know, for those of you who have a religious belief, sometimes reading about, there's a good book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Some of you know about that sometimes helps people sort that out, or talking to, you know, a religious person in your life may be helpful. Another one, of course, is the emotional dimension of grief. You know, as we talked about before, there's no logic to guilt. It is emotional. And then the behavioral dimension. You do things related to your guilt, such as self-punishment. And I want to ask you a question for a moment. This may be a hard one to think about, but I want you to think about this. Since the death of this child in your life, of your brother or your sister or your grandchild, how have you been hurting yourself? Suicidal feelings come up for people. They say things like, you know, I just want to let myself die. Over the years, many bereaved parents have said to me, Bob, if I were driving down the street and I saw, you know, a semi-truck coming at me, I wouldn't want to move out of the way and just let myself go, because I'll be with my child, my pain will stop. And if you're feeling those feelings, those are normal. But I ask you, if you died and let yourself die, all the pain that everyone else is experiencing from the death of your child, now they would have even more pain on top of it. And I know it's asking a lot for you to stay here and, you know, keep getting up each day despite all this pain. But I'm also here to tell you that I've talked to parents who have dealt with this for years and are able to look back and say that as hard as that was to get up each day, eventually they were glad that they did it, but at the time they certainly didn't feel that way. So there they are, just very quickly, 5 different dimensions of guilt. All right, we're ready next to talk about some suggestions. One is that understand this important fact, and this is why I put this one first, that when you start to feel less guilt, when you start to feel less grief, it doesn't mean that you're letting go of this precious person in your life. Some people get scared that as my grief is starting to subside, as I'm starting to move on a little bit, like Pat talked about, then, You know, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm losing my child. Well, you're not. You're never going to lose your child or your brother or sister. And let's take a look at some other ways that people have found. Some people have a personality tendency toward guilt. For some people, they have a high need for control. Okay? If you are the kind of person who have to have control over things and so on, then you just may have more of a personality tendency toward guilt, and you just, you know, say to yourself, well, I guess I can't fight it. That's kind of the person that I am. But there are things we can still do about it. And one is called flooding. And flooding says, go ahead and let yourself feel the guilt. Let it wash over you, rather than, I shouldn't feel guilty. Well, guess what? Now you're feeling guilty because you're feeling guilty, right? We can call that guilt, right? So, but let me take you then to what I'm talking about. Identify your guilt self-talk. That is, let that guilt flood over you and say to yourself, I'm going to go ahead and beat myself up. What? Here I am listening to this grief and guilt seminar, and the guy's telling me to, go ahead and beat myself up. Well, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is for you to go ahead and say, I should have, why didn't I, if only, and so on. But pick a date off in the future, the date of your loved one's birthday, or the day this person died, or some important date for you. So let's say, the important date is November 2nd. And you say to yourself, from now on, I'm just going to let myself say I should have, if only, why didn't I, because that's what our brain has to do over and over and over. But come November 2nd, when you wake up, from then on, when you start to catch yourself say, if only, why didn't I should have, and so on, you need to say to yourself, wait a minute, I beat myself up enough, and now I'm going to start to let that go, because the important thing is that I've done enough of this. Another one that parents tell me is, again, related to this hindsight bias, is to review what you're doing at the time and saying to yourself, I was probably doing what I would normally be doing, okay? But guess what? We often try to go back and say, well, I shouldn't have been doing that. Well, guess what? You're only human. And then this is especially important if you're experiencing role guilt. And, as the survey indicated, almost 80% of you are feeling some degree that I wasn't a good enough mother, father, or sibling. Okay? So the suggestion, and parents, again, have given me this suggestion, is sit down and write down, just put together a list of all the things that you did right with this child and all the things that you did wrong. So you get it out of your head and you get it on paper, because otherwise it just keeps going round and round and round and round, and it doesn't go anywhere. But get it down on paper. And there's another technique that psychology professionals use called thought stopping or partitioning. And that is, if you find that your guilt has become obsessive, that you're just over and over and over having all these guilt statements come up to you again and again and again, and you're waking up in the day and you're saying, I don't deserve to, and this was payment for, and I'm not worthy of, and I feel guilty, and I didn't take all those things are coming up for you. What you do is you can have a person help you with this, or you can just say it to yourself. So I'm going to count to 3 in a moment, and I'm going to say the word stop very loud, because that's what, as soon as you start to have those thoughts, that's what needs to come up in your brain. So I'm going to count to 3 and say the word stop very loud. 1, 2, 3, stop. And so what happens with that is that the theory is that if you can have someone do that with you, as soon as these thoughts start coming up, you sit down with them and say, okay, I'm going to think about the things that I say to myself when I'm guilty, and I want you, as soon as I hold up my finger, I want you to yell, stop, as loud as you can. And that kind of, for some people, it kind of, breaks that pattern a little bit and isn't so obsessive. And another one that's related to that is partitioning. That is, if you're going to feel guilty, you have to find a place to feel guilty. So let's say you have, your bedroom closet, okay? And you're saying to yourself, I'm starting to feel, well, wait a minute, I can only feel guilty when I'm so here you are going to bed at night, okay? So wait a minute, I'm not in my bedroom closet, I need to feel guilty. And that may sound sort of silly, but if you can make that agreement with yourself and say, I'm going to go ahead and feel guilty, but I got to do it in a certain place. I'll do it sitting on my patio, or sitting next to this tree, or sitting in the back seat of my car or whatever. Don't make it at a place where you are normally going to be. And then you know this one for those of you who attend meetings, how powerful it is to sit and share the feelings that you have about the loss, including your guilt, and have other people really hear you. Think of the last time you said something to someone and they really got it. They didn't judge you. They didn't try to talk you out of it. They just got it and how good that feels. Another one related to the list earlier, Mom told me that what she did is put together all the things I wish I'd done differently. All those. Because again, you got to get it down on paper. Type it out, write it out, but don't let it go round and round in your brain. Use the best friend approach. If the same thing happened to your best friend rather than you, what would you say to your best friend? Would you say, yeah, you need to feel guilty. Yeah, you should have done that. Right? No, you wouldn't say that to your best friend. So the question I have for you is, can you begin to treat yourself as well as you would your best friend? Can you let up and people say, no, I need to be harder on myself. Well, wait a minute. You would not do this to your best friend. Can in fact you let up a little bit on yourself. For some people, the spiritual approach helps. Where they sit down if they have a belief in God and have a conversation with God. Say, God, here's all the guilt that I'm feeling. And then ask oneself, so what is God saying back to me? Another one is compile memories. People often feel like I'm going to forget. Well, guess what? Get the pictures, write down the stories, ask other people what stories they remember, and start writing them down. Some people have written books, memoirs, poems, whatever it is. Put those together so you got the memories. And I'm going to be a little harsh right now. If you died today, some of the memories of your child or your brother or sister would die with you. And so part of your job, I think, is to sit down and put together those memories so other people will have them after you go especially. The next one I'm going to give you is the most intense one. So I want you to be ready for this one because it's not easy. I want you to think for a moment of what your loved one would say, what your son or your daughter, your brother or sister, your grandchild would say. If this person was going to come back for 10 seconds and say something to you about all of the guilt that you've been carrying. And so I'm going to be quiet for a moment. Even if your child died as a baby, I want you to imagine what the communication would be about all the guilt. So I'm going to be silent for about 10 seconds. And I know this is heavy and I can bring tears a little bit, but I want you to think and just be silent for a moment. What would this person say to you about all the guilt that you've been carrying? Now I'm going to be silent. All right. Come on back. And I know this was hard for some of you, but I want you to think about that from now on. What would your loved one want you to be doing? Guilt is a weight. It's something that we carry. If someone gave you a 50-pound weight and said, I want you to carry that around from now on, well, that's what it is. And part of your job is to lighten that load a little bit. And one of the ways to do it is to think, what would my loved one want me to be doing? And I've had, when I do this in a workshop, a dad will raise his hand and say something like, my 21-year-old son, he would say, died of suicide. And I heard my son's voice in my mind saying, Dad, I know you love me. Or a woman with a 3-year-old daughter who died in an auto accident. She heard her daughter say, Mom, I'm okay. I know that this is hard on you. So things like that can really say to you, this is what your loved one would want. And then write a letter to your son or daughter. You can do that. You can do that as often as you want. And then for some people they say, and then how would your loved one reply to you? Try a guilt-free day. Now this may sound a little hokey, but say to yourself, tomorrow, just let me get up and see if I can go through a day without the words, and maybe if the feelings come, I'm going to try to chase them away a little bit. And just see how that day would feel. And then maybe I can go for 2 days like that. Again, these are all different suggestions, and some of them will apply to you and others you go, no. a big question that I have for you that goes along with this one is, what would it take for you to begin to forgive yourself? Another one is to channel your guilt. Whenever I give a workshop on guilt, I say, I'd like the group facilitators, the TCF facilitators, I'd like you to stand up. Okay? And they stand up. I said, I want you to take a good look at these people, because these people are mentally deranged. Right? And everyone laughs. Why? Because these are the people who chose to step forward and try to keep together a Compassionate Friends chapter, and how hard that is and all the work they got to do and so on. And we all kind of laugh and realize that what have these people done? They have, in the name of their child, chosen to stand up and take charge of, of a group and make that group happen. And how wonderful it is that they would, take this guilt, this grief, and channel it into something, so important. Another one is to educate yourself. And you know what? By going through this seminar, this webinar right now, you've learned more about guilt than most people ever will. Earlier people are going to go, gee, I think I'll go to a guilt workshop, or I think I'll read a whole book on guilt or whatever. Well, guess what? You know some things about guilt. You know about some of the guilt statements. You know some of the types of guilt, some of the dimensions of guilt, and as we're working our way through it here, some of the suggestions for coping with it. So, but we as humans are the only species, think about this, who feel guilt any more than a few seconds, right? So I have a question that I'm going to just pose to you out there that I always ask people in my workshop. How many of you have a dog, right? All right, those of you that have a cat, or if you had a cat, what if this happened? That last night your cat sneaked out and had an affair with that cute one next door, right? Do you see your cat walking around today going, I can't believe I did that? What kind of cat am I? I'm so easy, right? And no, that's not what, the cat's doing. The cat's moving on, right? And so what do we do as humans, though? When something happens, we go around and round and round and round, and the past is never firm. It's never complete. We always have to replay it. And that's part of the complex brain that we have. So, you keep that in mind. And of course, an important thing here is to appreciate that we all grieve differently, and that we're all individuals. And for someone to come up to us and say, well, this is the right way to grieve, and this is the wrong way to grieve, we know that. But to appreciate the fact that when we look at grief, it's crazy. You are in and have been in a crazy world that you can't believe you would ever have been in. And now, hopefully, learning a little more about it, you'll be able to negotiate that a little better. And maybe at some point, you'll be that person who will be able to step forward and help other people who come after you. Pat, do we have some questions that came in that people would like to ask?
Yeah. Let's start with this one. Can you define the difference between guilt and regret?
Yeah.
And is there a difference?
Yeah, that's a great one. Guilt, one of the main differences between guilt and regret is that guilt has the emotional content to it. Okay? That guilt feels like a weight. Guilt is more an obsession and a feeling, whereas regret is, I wish I would have done it differently, but it doesn't carry that emotion. So think of, you start off with regret, you then add a layer on top of it, which is obsessing about it, and then you add a layer on top of that, which is all the feeling that goes along with it, and then you got more of guilt. Good question.
Great. Here's one from Karen. I have lost my husband and daughter in less than a year and a half. Why do I feel guilty when I'm grieving for one and not the other?
Yeah. Ooh-wee. Oh, that is heavy. Well, here's what I would do. I'd go back to that chat with your loved one, and talk to your husband. Listen to what your husband would say about, at times I'm thinking about my daughter more than I am you, and really have him listen to what and tell you what what he would feel about that. Because guess what? If he were in your place, he would feel the same way. It's like, what's wrong with me? How come I'm grieving for one and not the other? And when two people die fairly closely together, our brain has an incredible difficulty of sorting it out and saying, why am I crying? I'm like, how much am I crying for this person or that person? We can't divide it out. So it's 25% for this one, 75% for that one. We don't know. And also I would suggest the letter writing as well, and write a letter and maybe a reply and say, here's what I'm feeling. I'm feeling guilty because I'm doing more for one than the other, and my guess is when you get that reply, it's going to be, you know what, that's okay, because we know that you love both of us.
Good. Is there such a thing as rational versus irrational grief?
Oh, you mean guilt? Yeah, I say yeah hesitantly, because if we feel guilty, it doesn't matter what the circumstances were, that we perceive that we could have done something different, or we did something wrong, or we failed to do something. Let me give you an extreme example. I had a client years ago who, when I was involved in counseling, who was involved in a traffic accident, and because of his mistake, he ended up killing the people in the other two car and his wife, and had a head injury, and I had to help him eventually come to the understanding that this had happened. That's real guilt. I mean, that's rational, if you want to put it that way. He really did something. And yet here's this mother that I talked about earlier who had absolutely nothing to do with this truck, hitting her son's car. And yet both of those people feel guilty. And so for me, it doesn't matter, to what extent we were involved in it. If we feel guilty, then the job is, what do we do about our guilt? A good question.
Yeah. We have several questions about sibling grief and how to help a sibling that is guilty about their losing a sibling, or do you bring up the subject, or do you wait for them to initiate a conversation?
Well, my experience, and you probably agree, Pat, that quite often they're not going to bring it up. If they're 10 years old or 18 years old or 33 years old as a sibling, if their sibling died, they're not going to say, I'd like to sit down and talk about my guilt. But here's one suggestion that I have is that, you sit down with that person. Sometimes the best place to do it is either on the phone, or driving. If they happen to be driving with you in the car, they're sitting next to you, you're both facing straight ahead, and they don't have to look at you, and you say something like this: I was thinking about your brother the other day, and sometimes when someone dies, we might think it's something we did, or maybe something we didn't do. And then wait for a few seconds, and then say, did you ever feel that way? And then do what every good counselor does: shut up and wait for them to respond. And what you hope is that if there's something going on there, the unmentionable guilt or role guilt, I wasn't good enough brother or whatever, your job is to let them feel it. As soon as you start, we don't like to see our children in pain. And yep, that's hard work. But our job is to let our children be in pain, because guess what? They're going to work through that pain, and the laws of probability are that they're going to be alive longer than you are in dealing with that death. And so our job is, whatever guilt they have, you say, wow, that must be tough. That must be hard to feel this. And I miss her too, and I have some things that I wish I wouldn't have said or done, but thank you for sharing that with me. As opposed to, don't feel that way, or you shouldn't feel that. Guess what? That just shuts off the conversation right away. And you might want to go, let me jump in, might want to go on the Open to Hope website. There's a lot of articles. I've written a couple about sibling guilt, and other people have written about, dealing with sibling grief, that you can click on the topic and some articles will show up there, so that could be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Bob, this has been an excellent webinar. I thank you so much. We do have more questions, but our time is drawing to a close. Do you have anything that you want to say to kind of wrap things up, or?
What I said before, which is, now you've been educated a little bit about guilt, and that if you want more information, I've just posted up there my book that you can email me, and it's $10, and it's one that I wrote based on the input that I got from parents and widowed people and so on who were coping with guilt. And guilt is going to continue. Just because you've listened to this today, you're not going to walk away and go, oh, I'm fine. But what I want you to do is do something about it by doing some writing, talking to someone, and getting that out rather than letting it go round and round in your head. That's the worst thing can happen, is that you keep it inside. So find that good listener and get working in a way that it will help alleviate it a little bit, because you owe that to your loved one. Thanks,
That's great advice. I love the use the best friend approach. Really great. Yeah. Our webinars are recorded and posted on the Compassionate Friends website, which is www.compassionatefriends.org. You can join us on April the 12th when Dennis Apple will present Grief and Religion, How Religious Symbols and Rituals Can Assist Us in Our Grieving. You can visit TCF on the Compassionate Friends website, where you can find a local chapter and also links to our Facebook and Twitter pages. Thank you all for listening tonight, and Bob, thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
Good night.